That night, they began to torture Wesley. Count Rugen did the actual pain-inducing. The prince simply sat by, asking questions out loud, inwardly admiring the count's skill. The count really cared about pain. The whys behind the screams interested him fully as much as the anguish itself. And whereas the prince spent his life in physically following the hunt, Count Rugen read and studied anything he could get his hands on dealing with the subject of distress. "All right now," the prince said to Wesley, who lay in the great fifth-level cage. "Before we begin, I want you to answer me this. Have you any complaints about your treatment thus far?" "None whatsoever," Wesley replied, and in truth he had none. Oh, he might have preferred being unchained a bit now and then, but if you were to be a captive, you couldn't ask for more than he had been given. The albino's medical ministrations had been precise, and his shoulder was fine again. The food the albino brought had always been hot and nourishing, the wine and brandy wonderfully warming against the dankness of the underground cage. "You feel fit, then," the prince went on. "I assume my legs are a little stiff from being chained, but other than that, yes." "Good. Then I promise you this, as God himself is my witness. Answer the next question, and I will set you free this night. But you must answer it honestly, fully, withholding nothing. If you lie, I will know, and then I'll loose the count on you." "I have nothing to hide," Wesley said. "Ask away." "Who hired you to kidnap the princess?" "It was someone from Gilder. We found fabric indicating as much on the princess's horse. Tell me that man's name, and you are free. Speak." "No one hired me," Wesley said. "I was working strictly freelance, and I didn't kidnap her. I saved her from others who were doing that very thing." "You seem a reasonable fellow, and my princess claims to have known you many years, so I will give you, on her account, one last and final chance. The name of the man in Gilder who hired you. Tell me, or face torture." "No one hired me, I swear." The count set fire to Wesley's hands. Nothing permanent or disabling. He just dipped Wesley's hands in oil and brought a candle close enough to set things bubbling. When Wesley had screamed, "No one, no one, no one, no one, on my life," a sufficient number of times, the count dipped Wesley's hands in water, and he and the prince left via the underground entrance, leaving the medication to the albino, who was always nearby during the torturing times, but never visible enough to be distracting. "I feel quite invigorated," the count said as he and the prince began to ascend the underground staircase. "It's a perfect question. He was telling the truth, clearly. We both know that." The prince nodded. The count was privy to all his innermost plans for the revenge war. "I'm fascinated to see what happens," the count went on. "Which pain will be least endurable, the physical, or the mental anguish of having freedom offered if the truth is told, then telling it and being thought a liar?" "I think the physical," said the prince. "I think you're wrong," said the count. Actually, they were both wrong. Wesley suffered not at all throughout. His screaming was totally a performance to please them. He had been practicing his defenses for a month now, and he was more than ready. The minute the count brought the candle close, Wesley raised his eyes to the ceiling, dropped his eyelids over them, and in a state of deep and steady concentration, he took his brain away. Buttercup was what he thought of. Her autumn hair, her perfect skin, and he brought her very close beside him, and he had her whisper on his ear throughout the burning, "I love you. I love you. I only left you in the fire swamp to test your love for me. Is it as great as mine for you? Can two such loves exist on one planet at one time? Is there that much room, beloved Wesley?" The albino bandaged his fingers. Wesley lay still. For the first time, the albino started things. Whispered, "You'd better tell them." From Wesley, a shrug. Whispered, "They never stop. Not once they start. Tell them what they want to know and have done with it." Shrug. Whispered, "The machine is nearly ready. They're testing it on animals now." Shrug. Whispered, It's for your own good I tell you these things. My own good. What good? They're going to kill me anyway. From the albino. Nod. The prince found Buttercup waiting unhappily outside his chamber doors. It's my letter, she began. I cannot make it right. Come in, the prince said gently. Maybe we can help you. She sat down in the same chair as before. All right. I'll close my eyes and listen. Read to me. Wesley, my passion, my sweet, my only, my own. Come back. Come back. I shall kill myself otherwise. Yours in torment, Buttercup. She looked at Humperdinck. Well, do you think I'm throwing myself at him? It does seem a bit forward, the prince admitted. It doesn't leave him a great deal of room to maneuver. Will you help me to improve it, please? I'll do what I can, sweet lady, but first it might help if I knew just a bit about him. Is he really so wonderful, this Wesley of yours? Not so much wonderful as perfect, she replied. Kind of flawless, more or less magnificent, without blemish, rather on the ideal side. She looked at the prince. Am I being helpful? I think emotions are clouding your objectivity just a bit. Do you actually think that there is nothing the fellow can't do? Buttercup thought for a while. It's not so much that there's nothing he can't do, it's more that he can do it all better than anybody else can do it. The prince chuckled and smiled. In other words, for example, you mean if he wanted to hunt, he could out-hunt again, for example, someone such as myself? Oh, I would think if he wanted to, he could, quite easily, but he happens not to like hunting, at least to my knowledge, though maybe he does. I don't know. I never knew he was so interested in mountain climbing, but he scaled the cliffs of insanity under the most adverse conditions, and everyone agrees that that is not the easiest thing in the world to accomplish. Well, why don't we just begin our letter with Divine Wesley, and appeal to his sense of modesty? The prince suggested. Buttercup began to write. Stopped. Does divine begin with D, E, or D-I? D-I, I believe. Amazing creature. The prince replied, smiling gently as Buttercup commenced the letter. They composed it in 4 hours, and many, many times she said, I could never get through this without you, and the prince was always most modest, asking little helpful personal questions about Wesley as often as was possible without drawing attention to it, and in this way, well before dawn, she told him, smiling as she remembered, of Wesley's early fears of spinning ticks. And that night, in the 5th level cage, the prince asked, as he was to always ask, Tell me the name of the man in Gilder who hired you to kidnap the princess, and I promise you immediate freedom. And Wesley replied, as he was always to reply, No one, I was alone. And the count, who had spent the day getting the spinners ready, placed them carefully on Wesley's skin, and Wesley closed his eyes and begged and pleaded, and after an hour or so the prince and count left, the albino remaining behind with the chore of burning the spinners and then pulling them free from Wesley, lest they accidentally poison him. And on the way up the underground stairs to ground level, the prince said, just for conversation's sake, Much better, don't you think? The count, oddly, said nothing, which was vaguely irritating to Humperdinck, because, to tell the absolute truth, torture was never all that high on his scale of passions, and he would just as soon have disposed of Wesley right then. If only Buttercup would admit that he, Humperdinck, was the better man. But she would not. She simply would not. All she ever talked about was Wesley. All she ever asked about was news of Wesley. Days went by, weeks went by, party after party went by, and all Florin was moved by the spectacle of their great hunting prince, at last, so clearly and wonderfully in love. But when they were alone, all she ever said was, I wonder, where could Wesley be? What could be taking him so long? How can I live until he comes? Maddening. So each night the count's discomforts, which made Wesley writhe and twist, were really sort of all right. The prince would manage an hour or so of spectating before he and the count would leave, and the count still oddly silent. And down below, tending the wounds, the albino would whisper, "Tell them, please. They will only add to your suffering." Wesley could barely suppress his smile. He had felt no pain. Not once. None. He had closed his eyes and taken his brain away. That was the secret. If you could take your brain away from the present and send it to where it could contemplate skin like wintry cream, well, let them enjoy themselves. His revenge time would come. Wesley was living now most of all for Buttercup. But there was no denying that there was one more thing he wanted too. His time. Prince Humperdinck simply had no time. There seemed to be not one decision in all of Florence that one way or another didn't eventually come heavily to rest upon his shoulders. Not only was he getting married, his country was having its 500th anniversary. Not only was he noodling around in his mind the best ways to get a war going, he also had to constantly have affection shining from his eyes. Every detail had to be met, and met correctly. His father was just no help at all, refusing either to expire or stop mumbling. You thought his father was dead, but that was in the fake-out, don't forget. Morgenstern was just edging into the nightmare sequence, so don't be confused. And start making sense. Queen Bella simply hovered around him, translating here and there, and it was with a shock that Prince Humperdinck realized, just 12 days before his wedding day, that he had neglected to set in motion the crucial Gilder section of his plan, so he called Yellen to the castle late one night. Yellen was chief of all enforcement in Florence City, a job he had inherited from his father. The albino keeper at the zoo was Yellen's first cousin, and together they formed the only pair of non-nobles the prince could come close to trusting. "Your Highness," Yellen said. He was small but crafty, with darting eyes and slippery hands. Prince Humperdinck came out from behind his desk. He moved close to Yellen and looked carefully around before saying softly, "I have heard from unimpeachable sources that many men of Gilder have, of late, begun to infiltrate our thieves' quarter. They are disguised as Florinese, and I am worried." "I have heard nothing of such a thing," Yellen said. "A prince has spies everywhere." "I understand," said Yellen. "And you think, since the evidence points that they tried to kidnap your fiancé once, such a thing might happen again?" "It's a possibility." "I'll close off the thieves' quarter, then," Yellen said. "No one will enter, and no one will leave." "Not good enough," said the prince. "I want the thieves' quarter emptied, and every villain jailed until I am safely on my honeymoon." Yellen did not nod quickly enough, so the prince said, "State your problem." "My men are not always too happy at the thought of entering the thieves' quarter. Many of the thieves resist change." "Root them out. Form a brute squad, but get it done." "It takes at least a week to get a decent brute squad going," Yellen said. "But that is time enough." He bowed and started to leave. And that was when the scream began. Yellen had heard many things in his life, but nothing quite so eerie as this. He was a brave man, but this sound frightened him. It was not human, but he could not guess the throat of the beast it came from. It was actually a wild dog on the first level of the zoo, but no wild dog had ever shrieked like that before. But then, no wild dog had ever been put in the machine. The sound grew in anguish, and it filled the night sky as it spread across the castle grounds, over the walls, even into the great square beyond. It would not stop. It simply hung now below the sky, an audible reminder of the existence of agony. In the great square, 6 children screamed back at the night, trying to blot out the sound. Some wept. Some only ran for home. Then it began to lessen in volume. Now it was hard to hear in the great square. Now it was gone. Now it was hard to hear on the castle walls. Now it was gone from the castle walls. It shrunk across the grounds toward the first level of the Zoo of Death, where Count Rugen sat fiddling with some knobs. The wild dog died. Count Rugen rose, and it was all he could do to bury his own shriek of triumph. He left the zoo and ran toward Prince Humperdinck's chambers. Hi there. Thanks for joining our book club. If you'd like to join the conversation, I would love it if you would leave us a comment. And if you'd like to see more, check out the playlist.